12. Martha hesitated, then tapped on the door. "Doctor?" There was no answer, so she tried again, and this time was rewarded with a distracted, "Can I come in?" she asked. He said. She took that as a yes, so she opened the door. The doctor was sitting cross-legged on Chris's bed, staring broodally down at the necklace. He had arrived at the Pirellis an hour before, having made an educated guess that Martha would be there after trying the hotel first. He had listened to Martha's account of the various attempts the Hoboken had made to get their property back, and had made the requisite sounds of distress and sympathy when Amanda Pirelli had gone on about the damage done to her house. But Martha had sensed he was distracted, and as soon as he could, he had shut himself away with the necklace, saying that he needed some time to study it, to discover some chink in the Hoboken's armour. "It's starting to get dark," she said now. "Is it?" He swung his head up as though roused from a trance, and peered at the deepening mist outside the window. "Oh, yeah." "How are you getting on?" she asked, perching on the edge of the bed. He shrugged and grunted. He was evidently not in a communicative mood. Martha tapped the iron band encircling the necklace. "It's been quiet for a while now. No more attacks. Maybe the Hoboken have decided we're too much of a match for them?" "Doubt it," murmured the doctor. "They're more likely conserving their energy for the big showdown." "Is that what you're doing?" asked Martha, and was rewarded with the hint of a smile. Instead of answering, however, the doctor asked, "What time is it?" "I thought you were supposed to be the expert," she teased, then said, "About 5. "Couple of hours to the carnival," he said. "Isn't there any way we can stop it? Warn the townspeople? Call a meeting?" "They'll all be too busy apple-bobbing and stuffing themselves full of pumpkin pie by now," he said. "Besides, do you honestly think they'd believe us? They'd run us out of town." Martha sighed. "Haven't you got any sort of plan?" "Oh, I'll just do what I always do," said the doctor. "Which is?" He raised his hands like a boxer, feinted to the left. Suddenly she sensed the energy flowing back into him. "Roll with the punches," he said. Rick unhooked his werewolf costume from the back of his door and held it up. He looked at it for a long time, then sighed. He remembered how excited he had been when he collected it from Tozier's yesterday. It seemed like a lifetime ago now. He couldn't believe how his entire perception of life had changed in the past 24 hours. After school yesterday, he'd been looking forward to nothing more than trick-or-treating, going to the carnival, and watching a bunch of horror movies with his friends. Now all of that seemed like kids' stuff, trivial and pointless. He threw the costume onto the bed. He wouldn't be wearing it this year. He'd always thought that monsters were cool, but not anymore. Where would he be this time tomorrow, he wondered. Would he still be alive? Would Blackwood Falls still be standing? He looked out of his window. The green mist was the colour of sludge now, slowly deepening to black. Rick stared at it, and wondered whether he'd ever see daylight again. The lights from the carnival showground shone faintly through the thick green mist. The pop music blaring from the loudspeakers sounded tinny and distorted. On another day, the smell of hot dogs, burgers, and candy floss, or cotton candy as they called it here, would have set Martha's stomach rumbling. But tonight she was too nervous to be hungry, too wired to focus on anything but the potential showdown ahead. She glanced at the doctor. Her tension made the picture on the rucksack he was wearing seem funnier than it actually was. She giggled at the image of Jar Jar Binks grinning inanely back at her. "You look such an idiot wearing that," she said. He ran his hands over the front of his suit as though smoothing out the creases, an indignant look on his face. Then he realised what she was actually referring to. "Oh, this," he said, and jiggled his shoulders so that the rucksack, and the picture of Jar Jar, bobbed up and down. "Hey, don't knock the Binks clan. They're good people, very hospitable." "Yeah, right," she laughed. "No, I'm serious. Old George thought Jar Jar was a figment of his imagination, but people often mistake telepathic messages for their own ideas. Now Martha looked uncertain and a little horrified. You are joking, right? The doctor raised his eyebrows and waggled them mischievously. Mind you, he was way off the mark with all that stuff in episode 9. Martha turned at the sound of running footsteps. Was this it, she wondered, the first attack? 2 figures appeared out of the mist. The doctor stepped towards them angrily. I thought I told you to stay at home. Chris bridled. You're not my dad. This is going to be dangerous, Martha said reasonably. We know, but we can't just sit at home doing nothing, said Chris. This is our town, not yours. It's not even your planet, Rick pointed out, trying not to quail as the doctor glared at him. There was silence for perhaps 5 seconds. Then the doctor gave an exasperated sigh and spun on his heels. Humans, he muttered. It's your funeral, I suppose. He stalked away. Stick close to us and don't do anything stupid, said Martha. Whatever, muttered Chris. They passed through the entrance arch and into the showground, paying their entry fee as they went. To Martha, the brash cheerfulness of the overhead music seemed enforced, masking an underlying tension. Maybe it was her imagination, but many of the townsfolk seemed wary, apprehensive. The adults especially, murmuring to friends and neighbours in low voices, drifting aimlessly from stall to stall, looked as if they were only going through the motions of enjoying themselves. She wondered whether they had some premonitory sense of what to expect, having lived unwittingly on top of the Hovoken ship for so many years. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was merely the effect of the green mist working on the fear centres of their brains. The kids, at least, seemed relatively unaffected by the tension evident in their elders. Children from 3 upwards were running around, shrieking and laughing, dragging their parents from pillar to post, resplendent in their many and varied Halloween costumes. Wherever Martha looked, she saw miniature witches and demons, zombies and vampires, skeletons and ghosts. She, the doctor and the boys, strode through the crowds of excited children and subdued adults, suspicious and alert. The doctor sniffed the air at regular intervals. So far, so good, said Martha. He said noncommittally. They wandered over to a stall where the object was to throw darts into playing cards stuck to a board. Aces win prizes, announced the sign overhead. Try your luck, buddy, said a portly man in a checkered coat and bow tie. Distractedly, the doctor picked up a dart and threw it without really looking. It flew straight as an arrow and hit the ace of spades dead centre. Whoa! Exclaimed Rick and Chris in unison. Well, I'll be, said the portly man. Show off, murmured Martha, trying not to look impressed. You won the top prize, buddy. Take your pick, said the man. The doctor was still peering around the showground. You choose, Martha, he said vaguely. Martha pointed. I'll have the cuddly orangutan, thanks. It was almost life-size, with long arms and hands fastened together with Velcro. The stall owner looped it around Martha's neck. What am I supposed to do with this? She asked as they walked away. Do you want a serious answer to that question? Replied the doctor. Martha offered it to the boys. Chris gave her a withering look and shook his head. Rick looked momentarily tempted, then shook his head too. They did another circuit of the showground. Martha gave the orangutan to a little girl dressed as a spider who was getting off the carousel. The girl's mother looked suspicious until Martha said, I'm going back to England soon and can't fit it in my luggage. As they passed the hot dog stand for the second time, Martha's stomach turning over at the smell of frying onions, a sheepish voice from behind them said, Hi. Turning, they saw Thad in his mummy ghoul costume, his body wrapped in bandages, his face deathly white aside from his lips and the hollows around his eyes, which were black. He was wearing the expression of a disobedient dog expecting a kick from its owner. You got away then, he said. Yeah, Rick said heavily. No thanks to you. Thad squirmed. "I'm really sorry, Rick. I panicked. I was going to call you, but I was scared in case—" He tailed off. Rick said nothing, simply stuck his hands in his pockets and scowled. "It's all right, Thad," Martha said. "It was a natural reaction under the circumstances. I mean, we all ran, didn't we, Rick?" She looked at him pointedly. Rick shrugged. "I guess." "So we're okay then," said Thad. Rick looked at him a moment longer. Then the scowl left his face, the tautness went out of his body. "Yeah, sure, man." They shook his hands. All at once the doctor stiffened, drawing himself to his full height. Although Martha had been expecting trouble, she still shuddered at the grim intensity of his expression. "Something wicked?" she asked. "This way comes," he confirmed in a murmur. He bared his teeth at her like an ape. "Itching again?" "Oh, yes," he said. The eerie chanting of the Havocan rose to a crescendo. Their fingers twitched and flickered as they scratched fiery green sigils in the air. The black vines thrashed like trees in a frenzied storm, rippling with thick, soupy clots of glaucous light. The aliens were gathered in a circle, at the centre of which a crackling vortex was beginning to form. The vortex resembled a spinning tunnel composed of green smoke, a vaporous whirlpool lying on its side, which stretched 10-12 metres into the air. As though obeying a silent command, one of the Havocan drifted forward, clothes flapping in black tatters around it, and it entered the vortex. The instant it had disappeared, a second Havocan moved forward, and then a third. Oddly, however, even though the number of aliens left in the chamber was dwindling, their chanting was not. It echoed around the chamber, as though the very walls were imbued with it, as though their incantation, ancient and powerful and deadly, had taken on a terrible life of its own. A wind sprang up around the showground, making the plastic awnings of the various stalls flap and billow, the loops of coloured lights rattle like bones. The doctor, teeth clenched, hair blowing, ranged from side to side, peering up into the misty sky. Suddenly he pointed. "Here it comes!" he yelled. Martha followed the direction of his finger. Something was happening to the mist. Slowly, it was beginning to spin like water running down a plug hole. The eye of the vortex was maybe 30 metres above them, but at its centre, instead of darkness, she could see a pulsing rhythmic glow. It was faint at first, but as she watched it grew steadily brighter and began to expand outwards. It was as though something was coming, some celestial visitation approaching through a tunnel of light. Everyone had seen it now. Everyone had stopped what they were doing to stare up, awestruck and fearful. The only movement came from the fairground rides on the far side of the field. The only sound was the music still blasting from the loudspeakers, an inane accompaniment to a spectacle as breathtaking as it was ominous. The glow increased until it was a ball of blazing light, a miniature sun which illuminated the night sky and cast a sickly pallor across the proceedings below. The townsfolk began to murmur in fear, to gather their children close. All at once, multiple tendrils of green light erupted from the centre of the vortex, like an exploding firework. Each of the tendrils sought out a different child, encircling their victims in crackling loops of luminescence. As the green fire skittered up and down their bodies, the children stood rigid, their faces, those that weren't concealed behind masks, expressionless, their eyes staring ahead. Some parents screamed or began to cry. Martha heard a mother shouting, "Jeb!" over and over again. She heard another woman screech, "No! Leave my girl alone!" She even heard one father say angrily, "Come on, Jason, quit fooling around," as if this was some mass practical joke concocted by the children themselves. The kids, however, seemed oblivious to the anguish of their parents. Martha looked around, helpless and horrified, wishing there was something she could do. She half turned to speak to the doctor, but then felt a hand tugging at the sleeve of her leather jacket, an anxious voice calling her name. Turning in the opposite direction, she looked into Rick's wide-eyed face. "Look at Thad," he said. Like most of the other kids, Thad was encased in a funnel of shimmering light. Also, like the others, he was standing immobile, his expression slack, mouth hanging open. But as Martha looked at him, she realized something else was happening too. Slowly, subtly, Thad was beginning to change. His face was becoming wizened, his skin turning to parchment. The bandages around him were tightening, aging, acquiring a patina of mould and dust. The very shape of his body was altering, his bones elongating, his hands twisting into claws. His skull was stretching, his brow getting heavier. He was starting to hunch forward like an ape. "Doc!" Martha began. And then she realized a similar transformation was overcoming all the other children. Kids dressed as werewolves were growing taller, more bestial, their fingers lengthening into talons, real fur springing up on their bodies. Those dressed as witches were turning into withered crones, their hideous bent-nosed faces developing warts and boils. Those who had come as vampires were becoming sallow, their incisors lengthening to sharp points. It was happening all around the showground. Children were actually turning into the creatures they had dressed up as. They had just one common factor. The eyes of each were glowing a vivid, putrescent green. The changes took maybe 15 seconds. Then the lassos of light round the children's bodies withdrew, snapping back into the blazing eye of the vortex, like a vast creature retracting its tentacles. Horrified parents backed away from their kids. The monsters began to snarl and roar and hiss as they straightened up. They stretched their transformed muscles and shook their heads as though throwing off the effects of a deep sleep. Some raised their claws and looked around, taking a renewed and deadly interest in their surroundings. "Oh my God," Martha said, feeling sick. "They're going to get the kids to kill their parents, aren't they?" "Their parents and then each other," the doctor said grimly. "They need the terror and the blood." "That's horrible." To the Hovoken, it's just like pulling in at the petrol station and filling up the tank. "How do we stop it?" Martha asked. "Stay alive for a start," said the doctor. Before she could respond, he grabbed the collar of her jacket and yanked her backwards. The transformed Thad's claw-like hand swiped through the space where her head had been a split second before. Martha caught a glimpse of Thad's snarling, green-eyed, utterly inhuman face. Then she and the doctor were tumbling backwards over the low counter of a homemade jewellery store, scattering the carefully arranged displays of earrings and brooches and bracelets. The owner of the stall, a young woman with henna-red hair and a baggy jumper, had already taken refuge behind the counter and screamed as the doctor and Martha sprawled before her. Like a cat, the doctor sprang upright in an instant. "Shh," he said. "It's okay. You stay there. You'll be fine." Crouching low, he peered over the counter and was joined seconds later by Martha. The scene before them was one of sheer pandemonium. Adults were running, screaming from their children, who were pursuing them with murderous intent. A huge spider, probably the girl she had given the orangutan to, Martha realized with a thrill of horror, was scaling the metal framework of the now motionless Ferris wheel to reach the terrified adults trapped in the upper cars. Over by the main marquee, a group of adults were fending off a ravening horde of monsters with tables and chairs. Nearby, Rick was lying on the ground with Thad's hands around his throat, whilst Chris had his arms wrapped around Thad's chest and was trying to drag him away. Martha scrambled over the counter to give Rick and Chris a hand. Thad was drooling and snapping, his teeth long and yellow. If Chris hadn't been holding him, Martha had no doubt he would be trying to rip Rick's throat out. She looked around for something to use and spotted a second-hand bookstall. She crossed to it, grabbed the biggest hardback she could find, then ran back over to the three boys and swung the book at Thad's head. It connected with a hefty thunk, and Thad's grip loosened on Rick's throat. She was about to deliver another blow when a voice shouted, "Stop!" It was the doctor. "Don't hurt him," he said. "Whatever they look like, remember, they're still only children." "What are we supposed to do?" gasped Chris, still struggling with the half-dazed Thad. "Reason with him?" "Let me," said the doctor, dropping to his knees beside Rick's prone body and facing the bandaged ghoul that Thad had become. He reached out with both hands, then quickly snatched one back as Thad twisted and snapped at his fingers like a dog. He blew in Thad's face to distract him, then tried again, both hands snaking in to grip Thad's thrashing head. He pressed his thumbs into Thad's temples, and immediately the ferocious expression slipped from the boy's face. His eyes closed, and he slumped forward in Chris's arms. "Lower him to the ground gently," said the doctor, then swiftly examined Rick's throat. "You okay, Ricky boy?" Rick swallowed and winced, then nodded groggily. "Fine," he croaked. "Good man." Chris was looking at Thad, who was now snoring gently. "What was that?" he marvelled. "Vulcan death grip?" "Lepsillian massage technique," said the doctor. "He'll feel refreshed and bountiful when he wakes up." "Bountiful?" queried Martha. Lepsillian's favourite word. "It's all bountiful this and bountiful that on Lepsilia. Drives you bonkers after a while." He stood up and looked around, his jaw clenching as he took in the scene around him. 50 metres away, a group of demons, most of them horned and red-skinned, were laying siege to a burger van. The beleaguered members of staff were throwing whatever they could find at the attacking creatures: cutlery, cooking utensils, frozen burgers, even bread rolls. The demons, lithe and agile as apes, were shaking the van, leaping onto the roof, clawing at the staff through the side opening. "No," breathed the doctor, as one of the staff members panicked and made a break for it out of the back doors. He was a skinny guy of around 20, with curly hair and a scrappy beard. Although fear lent him an impressive turn of speed, he was no match for the trio of demons which broke away from the larger pack to pursue him. They fell on him like a pride of lions upon a gazelle. As the man began to scream, the doctor looked away, his face furious, and swung his rucksack from his back. "Chris!" shouted Martha, as a zombie came shambling up behind him, arms outstretched. Chris threw himself forward, rolling over and springing to his feet. The doctor tore open the rucksack and lifted out the necklace. With one blast of the sonic, the iron band securing it broke into 2 pieces and fell to the ground. The doctor held the necklace above his head. "This stops now," he yelled, pressing the still-active sonic against the necklace's cover. The fleshy material began to ripple and shudder as though in pain. "Show yourselves, Vulcan, or your precious book gets it." There was a bubbling in the boiling from the centre of the vortex, and suddenly there they were, a dozen or more Hovoken materialising out of thin air. They hovered 10 metres above the ground in a wide circle around the doctor, tall and spindly like great black carrion crows. Rick gasped at his first sight of the aliens and dropped to his knees. Chris moaned and cowered in fear. Martha clenched her fists, but stood her ground, shoulder to shoulder with the doctor. Hair still blowing around his head, arms raised aloft, the doctor shouted, "Right! This is the deal. Listen carefully. I'm not open to negotiation. You put an end to this slaughter now, or I'll destroy the necklace. And don't think I can't or won't, because I can and I will. I've broken through every one of its defences, and all I have to do is increase the sonic frequency by another few levels, and your indispensable little starter motor will be dust. And don't think you can snatch it away with your spells either. The sonic field has been configured to deflect any rescue attempt. You try to transmat this beauty, and your energy will bounce right back at you. As long as my sonic is in contact with your necklace, you can't do a thing, you can only listen." He paused briefly and looked around the circle of Evoken, his expression steely. Then he said, "Okay, what's going to happen is this. The people of Blackwood Falls want you out of their town and off their planet. So you put an end to this now, and I'll find you another source of fuel, one that doesn't involve killing people. I can do it. Easy. I'm good with engines. As soon as the ship's ready, we'll clear the town and you can vamoose. All right, you'll wreck a few houses, but so what? Houses are just things, aren't they? They're not important, like people, like lives. This way, you get your necklace back, and you get to keep your ship. Course, you'll have to keep an eye out for the Eternals whilst you're up there, but that's your problem. Once you're off this planet, our association ends." Despite the continuing screams and cries and roars, not to mention the still blaring music, the echoes of the doctor's voice seemed to ring out around the showground. The Havoken regarded him impassively, not responding. "Well, come on," the doctor shouted. "I haven't got all—" Something swooped from the sky, seeming to appear from nowhere. Martha ducked, thinking it was a huge bird, an eagle perhaps. The flying creature snatched the book from the doctor's hand before he had a chance to alter the frequency of the sonic. Martha saw that it was some kind of sprite or evil fairy, doubtless another of the transformed children. She looked back at the doctor, still not entirely sure what had happened, and saw an expression of horror on his face. "No!" he shouted. The Havoken leader gave a triumphant hiss and performed a magician-like flourish whose meaning was patently obvious. "You lose." The doctor and Martha could do nothing but watch as the sprite delivered the necklace into the Havoken leader's hands. The alien opened its mouth wide in what Martha could only think of as a gloating grin and muttered a quick incantation. A fizzing green light enveloped the necklace, and it faded away, to reappear seconds later in the hollow on top of the central dais in the main chamber of the Havoken ship. Instantly, the mass of claw-like roots fringing the hollow clamped into place over the book, like the jaws of a Venus flytrap closing on an unsuspecting insect. Martha felt numb. They had lost. The doctor had made the silliest, most fundamental mistake by not looking behind him, and suddenly it was all over. As some of the hideous creatures that had once been children closed in on them, Martha thought of her family, her mum and dad, and her brother Leo and her sister Tish. She thought of her flat and her job back in London, thought of how her life had changed so irrevocably in such a short time, all of the amazing things she'd done. She'd seen Shakespeare's England and 1930s New York. She'd been on the prison planet Volagnoc and travelled on real-life spaceships. She'd survived encounters with plasmavores and Daleks, real-life witches and giant pollution-guzzling crabs. And now it was all going to end here, ripped apart by a bunch of possessed children. As though he sensed her thoughts, the doctor took her hand in his and gave it a squeeze. She looked up at him. His face was sombre, almost wistful. "You really shouldn't have done that," he murmured to the Havoken. Then he held up his sonic screwdriver. The necklace convulsed, sending a shock wave through the Havoken ship. Then, like a giant sponge, it began to absorb energy, to suck the already thin lifeblood from the veins of the vessel at an incredible speed. Ripples of energy flowed from the thrashing vines. The central dais pulsed and shimmered as the ship's entire stock of reserve power converged on it. Like a heart engorged with blood, the necklace began to swell and rupture. As it absorbed more power than it was designed to hold, it started to glow fiercely, like a reactor core reaching critical mass. A high-pitched whine filled the Havoken ship, a whine that escalated rapidly into what sounded like a scream of unbearable pain. The ring of transformed children closing in on the Doctor, Martha, Rick and Chris suddenly stopped. Some of the creatures stood stock still, like soldiers awaiting orders, whilst others began to sway and stagger about in confusion. One child, which had become a hulking Frankenstein's monster with a scarred patchwork face and clomping lead boots, raised its hands to its head and dropped to its knees with a groan. As Martha watched, she saw the greenish lustre fade from the children's eyes, and then a ripple of energy leave each of their bodies and spiral upwards into the vortex of mist. The image made her think of a mass of souls vacating the bodies of the dead. However, these children were not dying. Instead, they were being given back their lives. The instant the energy left them, each of the kids reverted to how they had been before the Havoken spell had consumed them. As they became themselves again, they looked around, dazed and shocked, as if waking from a collective nightmare. A few burst into tears. Some cried out for their parents. Martha watched the Frankenstein's monster peel the mask from its face and realized it was Rick's friend, Scott. Meanwhile, something was happening to the Havoken. They were beginning to thrash about like black sheets in a strong wind, to wail in their thin, childlike voices. The doctor watched them unblinkingly, his face like thunder, sonic still held out before him, its piercing warble splicing the air. The thrashing of the Hovoken became increasingly more frenzied. Martha thought of animals caught in traps, struggling desperately to escape. She saw their huge, pale heads beginning to blacken and shrivel, their eyes sinking into their sockets, their many-jointed fingers curling up like burning twigs. Finally, their bodies began to crumble away like vampires in sunlight, and within seconds they were nothing but ribbons of black ash streaming into the centre of the vortex. With the Hovoken gone, the green mist which had shrouded Blackwood Falls since the necklace had been unearthed over 24 hours earlier began rapidly to disperse. It too drained into the vortex, the radiance at the centre of which gradually faded and shrank until there was nothing left but darkness. Once the mist had cleared, the vortex itself dwindled and died, simply petering out like a spent tornado. Suddenly, Martha realised that for the first time since they had arrived, she could see stars twinkling in the night sky. She took a deep breath, relishing the cold, clean sharpness of the air. She turned to the doctor and was about to speak when she heard and felt a deep subterranean rumble. Almost immediately, the night sky some distance away was illuminated by a harsh white glow, which surged upwards before disintegrating into a million greenish sparks that winked out as they fell slowly back to earth. "What was that?" asked Rick in a small, shocked voice. Martha began to shake her head, and then all at once it came to her. "It was the Hovoken ship, wasn't it, Doctor? The tree. You did something to the book, didn't you? Drained off their energy." The doctor, his face grim, turned off his sonic and pocketed it before giving her a curt nod. "Never underestimate the power of the printed word," he said. End of story. The doctor and Martha stood with the Pirelli family, staring into the ash-filled crater at the bottom of the garden. There was no trace whatsoever of the black tree. Not a single twig had survived. "I don't believe this," Tony Pirelli kept saying, shining his torch down into the hole. "I just don't believe it." The doctor said nothing. His face was expressionless, his hands stuffed in his pockets. It was Martha who had insisted on taking the boys home. The doctor had wanted to slope off without saying goodbye, leaving the Blackwood Falls townsfolk to pick up the pieces of their lives. "Believe me," he had said to her, "it's easier that way." "For who?" she had demanded, and he had just sighed. In the end, he had agreed to stay a bit longer. He might be the one who usually called the shots, but when she dug her heels in, when she made it known that something was important to her, he was usually okay about it. People had died tonight. Wherever they went, people always died. And Martha thought part of the reason the doctor never wanted to stick around afterwards was so that he didn't have to come to terms with that. Maybe he thought that death followed him around, that when people died it was his fault. He had saved countless lives, even in the short time she had been with him, but he never failed to be haunted by the ones he didn't save. Rick looked up at the doctor, now with something like awe. "What did you do?" he asked. "I subverted the kinetic flow of the energy generated by the necklace," the doctor replied. "It caused the ship to implode." He sounded almost ashamed. "Huh?" said Rick. "He made their spells run backwards," said Martha, knowing she was massively oversimplifying what in reality was no doubt a very convoluted and technical explanation. "He undid everything the Hovoken had done." Suddenly a thought struck her. "Hey, does this mean Mr. Clayton will have got his mouth back?" "Suppose," muttered the doctor. "Well, that's good, isn't it?" she said, trying to cheer him up. He replied. "So this necklace thing," said Chris, "you changed it with your little torch when you were hanging out in my room this afternoon." "It wasn't hard," said the doctor almost apologetically. "It was just a bit of basic tinkering." The hard bit was convincing the Hoboken they'd beaten you, said Martha. You certainly fooled me. The doctor shrugged. They'd have been suspicious if I'd just given the necklace back to them, even if I'd made it sound like an exchange for the lives of the townspeople. They'd have checked it over and found out what I'd done. I knew our only chance was to make them think they'd outsmarted me. They will hoist with their own petard. But what if they'd agreed to your terms, said Martha. Would you have fixed the necklace for them and let them destroy the town? The doctor frowned. I knew they wouldn't. But what if they had? He looked at her, and his eyes suddenly seemed as black and depthless as space. I gave them their chance, he said evenly. They didn't take it. Martha saw Tony and Amanda Pirelli looking at the doctor almost warily, and knew what they were thinking. Is this the kind of person we want our boys hanging around with? Excuse me, mister, Tony said almost hesitantly, but who exactly are you again? I'm just a traveller passing through, the doctor said. What's that supposed to mean? Asked Amanda. The doctor shot Martha a look. See, I told you it was easier to just leave. A voice came floating out of the darkness beyond the crater. Sounds like we might be in for a spot of subsidence, thanks to you, Doctor. Etta, said the doctor delightedly. In the nick of time, as always. Tony shone his torch into Etta's face. Do you mind? She said, raising a hand. Sorry, he said, and lowered the beam, lighting the way ahead for her. My, what a big hole, she said. My garden fence is down there somewhere. Mind you, I think I prefer it without the tree. Much more neighbourly, don't you think? Yes, said Tony. Etta was carrying a large plate, which she held out towards the group. Who's for a Halloween cookie? The cookies were in the shape of bats, coated with black icing with red dots for eyes. I think I'll pass if you don't mind, Martha said with a shudder. Me too, said Rick, then caught a warning look from his parents. Then again, maybe not. Lovely, said the doctor, shoving most of a cookie into his mouth. He made exaggerated yum-yum noises and grabbed another from the plate. Then, after a moment's hesitation, a third, which he dropped into his pocket. Right, he said. Well, better go. Things to do, people to see. Goodbye all. Come on, Martha. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and strode away, leaving Martha smiling sheepishly round at the group. Sorry, she said. He doesn't like goodbyes. Well, I'd better... She wafted a hand vaguely in the doctor's direction. Etta smiled. Go on, dear. You catch up with your spaceman. And tell him, thank you. On behalf of us all, tell him thank you for saving our town. I will, said Martha, and raised a hand. Well, bye everyone. Maybe I'll see you again sometime. She doubted she would, though. That was what life with the doctor was like. Meet people, share extraordinary times, move on. Wait up, Doctor, she shouted, jogging after his gangly silhouette. And although she wanted to, she didn't look back. Not once.